Hello and welcome back to another episode of RE Radar. On the docket today, what I have got for you guys is an interview with James Mallory, the president of Environix. And what Environix kind of is their goal is they provide Western Washington with honest professional solutions to different complex environmental issues. I hope I didn't mess up anything there, but thank you very much for joining me today, James.
Happy to be here.
hmm And so, just hopping right into a couple of questions, just getting more info on Environix for the audience here. When did you begin Environix, and what was kind of the reason behind that company coming together?
Yeah, we started Environix in 2003. A buddy of mine actually started, a friend from college, about 6 months before I showed up. And he was selling insulation for new construction and found that a lot of the jobs were being put on pause because the installers were finding mold in the crawl space, subfloor, things like that on the walls. And it was a pretty expensive issue. Whether the worst case scenario was if they installed all the insulation and then found mold after. As you can imagine, people buying a new house are not super excited to find the crawl space covered in mold. So that was the first spark. As he noticed, the caliber of companies coming out to fix this seems fairly low, and it was very expensive. So it was a perfect market opportunity to say, I think we can do a lot better job of this, and we can save people money in the process. So I came on maybe 5, 6 months after Mike had started it, and we began with those first contractor style customers and then grew it from there.
And kind of what are some of those main calls that you had been getting early on, and has that switched at all? Are there any new mold coming out, anything like that that you're finding, or has it stayed pretty consistent?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say the basic calls around mold have stayed the same. It's just broadened. And then we'll get to that in a second. But in some ways, it's surprising because if you had asked me 22, 3 years ago when we started this, that we would still be at this level today, I would have said, no, building code is going to figure this out. Contractors are going to identify better ways to build a house, and eventually our business would decline. Good for customers, bad for us, but that was my prediction. And I found that to not be the case because building code is actually making it more likely we'll have mold problems. And whether, of course, water sources, none of that's changed. So the mold's there. The way we're building houses has, if anything, exacerbated it. So the basic foundation of the phone call has been fairly steady. Either people see mold on the wall and say, hey, why is this here? Got to figure it out. Or they don't feel well. They have some sort of health issue and perhaps a reference from their doctor or something like that. They start thinking, maybe it's my house that's causing a problem. The one thing I've seen that has changed quite a bit is people's general awareness of like chemicals in the air, VOCs, indoor air quality. That's increased a lot. In the old days, even just 10, 15 years ago, when if you'd said pollution to somebody, you would just automatically think outside. Wildfire smoke, exhaust from cars, living near a city, you'd think outside. Now, people are much more attuned to the fact that pollutants can be much worse indoors than outdoors. So we get a lot more phone calls of people that kind of have that background knowledge and awareness of, man, I want to have my indoor air quality checked out. Even if there isn't maybe a specific known incident happening right then, they just have a general health concern for that.
That's interesting right there, because yeah, you would expect maybe the mold would go down over time. You'd expect industries to figure these things out, but apparently that's not what you're seeing. There's more calls about mold coming in now than 20 years ago, huh?
Yeah, and it's a fundamental tension between the more energy efficient you make a house, in general, I would say almost without exception, there are some exceptions, but in the vast majority of cases, you are going to decrease indoor air quality. And if you think about it, it makes sense. So the way to improve the energy efficiency of your house is to tighten it up and you stop that air leakage. So you're not having to pay to heat up more air or cool it in the summer. Well, that very nature of sealing a house up is also sealing all the pollutants and moisture in the house. And the only
That's
way to fix that is fairly expensive, and it's beyond the energy penalty of just venting a house. So perhaps I think the most Ironic and funny example of this is current code calls for very tight houses, right? You have to air
Mhm.
seal and spray foam all your penetrations, your top plates. You got to really seal a house when you build it today. So much so that the same code that requires that sealing of the house requires you to mechanically ventilate the house, and in many cases, literally put holes in your exterior walls with passive vents
Mhm.
to allow that air to escape. So we're realizing, oh boy, we can't tighten houses up this much, so let's kind of reverse all those gains and ventilate it. I mean, I get it because the only way to really do that right is a pretty expensive piece of equipment where you can vent without the energy loss, but in our mild climate in the Pacific Northwest, almost nobody's willing to spend the money for that. So we're just in a funny no man's land in between kind of two phases of the code. And
Yeah, that is interesting right there. Because yeah, everyone wants a airtight home so they don't have to spend as much on heating and all that. But airtight isn't always the best. Now, what are some ways that homeowners could potentially prevent some of these different issues from actually beginning in the first place?
it's actually, I think, much easier than most people realize. If you live in Alabama or Florida or Texas, your humidity happens in the summer. Well, maybe the winter as well, but you feel it in the summer and it's annoying. There's nothing you can do about that without dehumidifying that air. You've got to suck the moisture out. In the Northwest, all of our humidity happens in the winter. Our summers are fairly dry, low humidity. It's in the winter when we have our humidity problems. Most people don't necessarily recognize this because you don't feel it on your skin. If you walk outside in January, take a day like today, it's maybe 45, and the humidity could be fairly high, but you would never feel it because the absolute amount of moisture in the air is still low. It's just the temperature makes that relative humidity go up. So, all that being said, it's actually very simple to solve it because all we have to do is bring in fresh air to drive down the humidity. And I'd say probably 85, 90% of phone calls that I get for mold related issues are driven by humidity. If you have
Mhm.
a leak, yeah, you can certainly have mold growth, but typically people see that and they stop the leak and they dry it out. So most of the worst problems that we run into where it's really systemic throughout a house are not from leaks. It's from background humidity that has caused mild to moderate mold growth throughout the house. All that can be fixed by just bringing in fresh air in the winter months and maintaining a warm house. It confuses a lot of people because they look outside and think it's 45 degrees and raining. How on earth is bringing in that fresh air going to help anything? That's about as
It's kind
wet
of
air as you can get.
contradictory right there.
But what people I think fail to recognize, we're talking about relative humidity. And that word relative tells us a lot. It means that it's the amount of moisture that specific temperature of air can hold. So if you take that 45-degree air that's saturated and soaked from a rainy day and you bring it in your house, which is what a bath fan does or any sort of ventilation, you're sucking air in, and you heat it to 70, well, the air expands dramatically, the volume. But the amount of water stays the exact same. So your relative humidity goes down from 100% way down to like 40. You'll never have mold growth. And all you've done is you've brought in wet, cold air, heated it up. Problem solved. So
Open up a window.
95% of our advice for customers, I mean, we have to fix maybe a more complex cleanup, but the long-term solution is always some form of let's reduce the humidity, improve ventilation.
Just open up that window
Yep,
and
yep. And the window thing
yep.
is funny, just to hit that for a second, is
Hmm.
that, it's pretty psychologically hard to keep a window cracked when it's 25 out in January. It's not comfortable, and you just are constantly thinking, what a waste of money. I'm heating up the great outdoors. So that's where we like to have it mechanical, where we automate a bath fan at a low setting or hook it up to your furnace, some way where it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's doing the necessary ventilation, but it helps you resist the temptation to go turn it off. And it
Hmm.
just kind of builds it into the baseline operating of the house.
Yeah. And now, before I get into a little hypothetical on some mold growth, I'd love to throw in and just talk about asbestos with you for a little bit. I know that's a topic that a lot of people probably have heard of asbestos. Do you guys deal with that at all? What's your opinion, I guess, on asbestos and how to deal with it, or if you do?
Yeah, so we do asbestos testing and evaluation. We don't do the abatement.
Hmm.
So we'll often make that handoff to a customer, to another third-party contractor to do the cleanup. Asbestos is interesting. So a few quick basics that not everybody may understand is that asbestos itself, if it's just sitting there in a material in your house, it's not doing anything. You have to be mechanically agitating it, cutting out some sheetrock, cutting out vinyl tile, something like that to aerosolize those fibers. So you could have a popcorn ceiling embedded in asbestos, and as long as you don't degrade it, cut it out, sand it, something like that, it has zero health impact whatsoever. It can stay there for the life of the building and not affect anything. It only matters when you start cutting it out. You're technically allowed by the law to do it yourself. Laws kind of make the assumption that, look, if you mess it up and it's your own health, oh well.
It's on you.
It's on you. It can't be your own house if you rent it. You've got to be occupying your own house to do that. And you still have to follow certain disposal laws and such. But a lot of people take that and think, okay, I'm going to go pull my own samples. And then if it comes back high, I guess I'll rent the equipment and scrape my popcorn ceiling and do this fairly extensive undertaking to save money because it can be quite expensive to have professionals remediate it. What I find is that a lot of asbestos is not necessarily classified as an asbestos-containing material once the right testing is done. If you just go scrape a few pieces of sheetrock, send it to the lab, let's say 70-80% of the time if it's popcorn ceiling, it's going to come back at 1.5%. Very normal result. You're going to get that paper and say, well, bummer. I guess I got to hire a contractor. There goes $10,000, $20,000. Or I'll try to do it myself, and it's a fairly epic undertaking. What they don't realize is that there's a secondary type of test that's much more exacting. It's much more precise. And that will drop the amount of asbestos in almost all scenarios under that 1% threshold. Or it'll drop it by 1%. And, without getting too deep into the weeds, what this means is that many, many times what initially starts out as asbestos-containing material, with further testing that's not terribly expensive, certainly in the grand scheme of what you're going to pay to remediate it, will drop under that 1% threshold, and then it's not considered an asbestos-containing material. The cleanup becomes dramatically less expensive. So this is a fun way that we're able to often save people many, many thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars. And if you do it as a homeowner, that testing procedure is very likely not going to come up. So if people were to take away a summary of that without trying to memorize the percentages, just think the initial result from your asbestos testing is often not the final answer. There is more can be done to further evaluate. Does that really cross the threshold of asbestos containing material? And in most cases, we are able to offer good news and say, hey, further testing, we're underneath that number. It's a less intense procedure.
And then another just key point, I think, really just to emphasize is the idea that as long as it's left alone, you're in theory fine.
Exactly.
So,
And in fact, I've been really changing my tune on advice for people for popcorn ceilings. I find in many cases it's better to, instead of scraping it, just put on a fresh layer of sheetrock on the ceiling. Because what happens, actually it's happened to my own house. My prior house was built in the 50s, and I scraped all the popcorn ceiling off and didn't realize until it was all scraped off that the underlying ceiling was in really bad shape. But the popcorn ceiling kind of hid the imperfections, and you all this effort to scrape it, and then, wow, that ceiling looks terrible. And it takes a lot of work to try to get it back up. So in many cases, you'll have a better result if you just leave the popcorn, get a sheetrock contractor to put 3/8 inch sheetrock on top. You don't have to treat it as asbestos because you're not tearing it out. You're just screwing it up. You're encapsulating it. You'd have to remember it was there if you ever had like a water damage roof leak or something. But short of that, you don't need any additional procedures, and you'll typically have a better final aesthetic look to it than trying to scrape it off.
Yeah, that's a great point right there. Now, getting into the little hypothetical here, back to the mold. Now, let's say someone were to notice that they'd started to have some mold accumulate underneath the roof in one of the joists. Let's say some mold's growing. They notice a little mold up there. First part, just what would you say, in your professional opinion, would be the most likely reason for that mold up there?
Yeah, in almost all cases, it's going to be related to excess moisture, vapor form coming into the attic from the house, or there's not enough ventilation to get the natural amount of moisture out. So
Hmm.
we're either talking disconnected bath fans, so you're just blowing hot, humid air into the attic, or you've got missing or insufficient vents. Often the vents are blocked by insulation. The soffit vents were covered by the insulation contractor, or often when it's just re-roof, they just didn't put in enough
Hmm.
vents to begin with. So I'd say the majority are ventilation related. Finding a disconnected bath fan is great because you got this smoking gun,
Hmm.
fix it in 10 minutes, you're done. I'd say usually it's a combination of that and some missing venting. A disconnected bath fan will typically affect a fairly small area, and often we see these issues. They're somewhat widespread. So there's a third factor that is very surprising to people, I think, is that often too much insulation can cause mold growth in an attic. Again, this is so counterintuitive because people
Yeah.
think, well, I'm doing the right thing. I'm going to add some insulation to my attic and help improve the R value of my ceiling, lower my energy bills. All that's true, but the more insulation you add, the colder your roof sheathing becomes.
Hmm.
And as we talked about earlier, the colder something is, the higher the relative humidity is going to go up. So, all things being equal, if you've got an old 50s house with 4 inches of insulation, and then you come in and blow in R50, you better make sure your ventilation's really dialed and all your other air sealing factors are in really good shape because that roof was staying warm from the lack of insulation, and that's going to go away once you got 20 inches of insulation. That's going to be very cold. So that's a really surprising one that I think no insulation contractors out there saying, hey, be careful, this might cause mold. It's just not really on the radar because they're thinking pure energy efficiency. That is something to keep in mind when people are adding insulation or replacing it.
Now, let's say this person, they never noticed this mold accumulating up there. How long or what would happen if it was just left alone and nothing was done for that mold growth that started accumulating?
Yeah, so most of the attic mold problems are fairly slow. They're not
Mm.
something that happens over months, unless it's really severe, unusual case. Typically, these are multi-year incidents that cause this growth to occur. In the first few years, it's going to mostly an aesthetic nuisance. It's going to be hard to sell that house because you're going to
Mm.
have visible mold. It's not typically going to affect the air quality. There's something we always like to point out that the air in your attic is going up and it's about to leave it. The air in your house is going into your attic. It's called the stack effect. So warm air is always rising, and that is true in a house.
Mm.
So it's very unusual for attic mold to come back down into the house. So we try not to phrase it as a health issue. It's a roof structural moisture
Mm.
issue, probably not going to affect the air quality of the home. Now, that being said, over time, what it'll do is it will degrade that roof sheathing. Whether it's OSB or plywood, that moisture and the fungal growth will eventually degrade the structural integrity of it. And home inspectors feel this, and roofers when they're checking out a house. You've probably seen this in real estate. A home inspector comes down and says, the roof feels
Mm.
spongy. That's what they're referring to, is that over the years, that moisture saturation has caused it to lose its stiffness and its structural integrity, which means eventually they'll need to replace that sheathing, which would add a lot of cost to the re-roof. None of these are catastrophic. None of these are things I would say don't buy a house because it has it. These can all be fixed. It just means when you re-roof, you might have a few extra $1,000 of cost to replace the sheathing, whereas if you nailed your ventilation. So I think a mold in an attic is first an indicator that something's wrong, and that will drive us toward fixing the ventilation that over the long term will cause a more expensive issue.
I guess you started touching on it, but what would be the steps to take with fixing this mold issue?
Yeah, so the first thing we're going to do is fix all the ventilation. We're going to make sure the moisture management in the attic is dialed. So often the least expensive solution is actually our most effective, where we air seal the ceiling, which is what a new construction house has done to it. Anywhere there's a hole basically going into your attic, so anywhere you've got an electrical wire coming up, can lights, things like that, we're going to air seal those. That's by far the most powerful preventative aspect. We want to stop the air from bringing moisture into the attic. Once that's done, then if the house needs more soffit vents, ridge vents, we'll fix the venting. And at that point, you've solved the future problem. The trick is That mold, it will perhaps die is not the right term, go dormant. Once you've pulled the moisture out and it's operating in a good condition, that mold can't grow ever. It's like a seed that doesn't have any water. It's just going to stop. But it doesn't change visually. It'll look the exact same.
Hmm.
So 10 years could go by and it'll look as black and unpleasant as it did 10 years prior. So what we've found is that it's very difficult for somebody to sell their house and tell the prospective buyer, no, 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 I fixed it. Look at all the venting I did. Look at all this. And then they go up in the attic and say, yeah, but it's covered in black mold. So
Hmm.
really? And we have found it's much better just to have the fairly minor additional cost to treat the attic, so we'll kill the mold, and then put an encapsulating layer on top. And what that is it blocks all the residual staining. The mold's dead, so that part's fixed. But we need to do something to address all that staining on the underside of the sheathing. The other benefit is it's the only way to know if it's really come back. If you don't fix that staining really well, then you get called back 2 years later and they say, hey, I think you messed up. The venting was not done right, and here's the evidence. There's mold regrowing. Well, it's really difficult to tell if that's actually fresh mold growth or that's just the old staining, right? So if you encapsulate it, we find it makes it much more straightforward. We say, oh, there is a little bit of mold. That's on us. So we're going to come out, we're going to retreat it, we're going to address the other venting, but it'll be super obvious if there's any regrowth. So that's our final stage, is to do an encapsulating treatment of that layer.
So fixing the flow of air and the ventilation is really the key part. But then in this day, I mean, aesthetics is what's going to be very important. So you're going to want to do another additional step just to make it more at ease for the owners and for them to potentially sell it more easily down the road. That's very
Yeah, and
cool.
then that final part of it's how we can provide a valid
Mhm.
warranty. Because without that, it's really hard to, we would always be arguing over whether that's fresh
Mhm.
growth or not. So, yeah, we tend to steer clear of presenting the spray treatment as some, super mold killing chemical that's going to permanently stop all mold. I find that's what the industry tends to promote is we've got mold killer 2000 and it's better and it's going to zap the mold and prevent it from coming back. There's no treatment out there that will do that. You
Mhm.
can easily kill mold. That's not that hard. Preventing it from coming back, you could put the most potent mildewcide coating out there, but within weeks, a layer of dust will settle on your fancy treatment.
Yeah.
And then that mold is just going to grow in the dust and eventually go through the treatment. This is
Mhm.
why you see mold on metal frame windows in an old house sometimes, the glass. Well, mold obviously can't eat aluminum, right? Or glass. So what's it doing? It's growing on the dust that's on top of that surface. So again, you got to fix the fundamental moisture
Mhm.
or it will come back. So the treatment is an important part, but it's certainly not the centerpiece of fixing an attic issue.
And now, wrapping up with just one final question for you. It is a broad one. Is there just anything else that you'd like to speak on for a minute that you think could be very important for the audience to hear?
Yeah, I think a quick note on air quality testing for mold would be really helpful. That's
Hmm.
probably where I see the most expensive mistakes made. It really comes
That's
down
a
to this
good
question of
point to
what's
make right
normal,
there.
what's kind of a background level. Because without knowing what's normal, it's really easy for contractors to convince people that the house is full of mold and they need to spend thousands of dollars on some expensive remediation. So, a few quick basics. Mold spores are everywhere. You're breathing mold right now. I'm breathing mold. Even the cleanest house out there, short of a clean room in a hospital, there are hundreds of mold spores in every cubic meter, often thousands. So, the question is not whether or not mold spores are present. They are everywhere. The question is whether they are present at an abnormal level. And really, what that's helping us define is did these mold spores just blow in through the front door when I opened it, or come in on the dog, or whatever, through a window, something like that? Or are these high enough to indicate that no, I've actually got mold growing somewhere in the house? That's the critical distinction. So, the way to figure that out is to know what normal outside mold spore counts. Yeah, so we have a lab that provides us with monthly averages, for example, for the region, because it changes dramatically season to season. Some molds could be at 1,000 spores per cubic meter right now, and in the summer are down to 50. So you've got to know those trends. If you take a sample of a house, we'll compare it to normal numbers. The opposite happens when you don't have that comparison. This is what typically happens: is a customer gets a report and says you have 150 mold spores in your air per cubic meter, and people think, well, 150, that sounds like a lot. That sounds bad. I don't want 150. I want zero. And maybe there's some scary red bar graph on there, so they get very concerned, and they're very vulnerable to contractors taking advantage of that fear. And what they often don't realize is that that particular spore, that mold type that was at 150, normally is at 500 or 1,000. So 150 is very clean. In fact, I'd be hard pressed to get it that clean after extensive HEPA vacuuming and filtration. That's a very low number. So anybody who's doing any mold testing done, whether you buy a kit, which I typically don't recommend for these reasons, or you have an inspector come in, you got to know what normal baseline is before you take action. And then I guess the final point related to that is consider what changes testing will result in. So, for example, I see a lot of contractors or inspectors testing attics for mold, the attic sheathing. And I would always hit pause in those situations and think, well, regardless of what type it comes back, is that going to change your protocol? Are you going to treat it differently if it's one type of mold versus the other? No, you're not. It's going to be the exact same. So why spend the money on it? It's the same thing with much of the testing in a house. Is if you walk into a room and there's a flood damage and mold everywhere, there's really no point in testing it. You need to clean it up no matter what. I mean, save it for a clearance test after, sure. But if it's obvious and clearly needs to be cleaned up, don't spend the money on testing. Spend the money when you are unsure, and typically that is a humid house, musty odor, like a basement with a musty odor. Maybe there's past water damage, but there's no visible mold anywhere, but you got a strong musty odor, maybe people aren't feeling well. That's a great candidate for testing, because it might have a strong musty odor, but the test results come back very low. And now you're just dealing with a nuisance and it smells bad. And okay, well, you can try to fix that and address it, but at least you've eliminated the health issue. Or it can come back very high. Now you talk about replacing carpets and addressing vapor barrier issues and things like that. So it really would change how you would remediate the house. So that would be, I think, my encouragement around testing for customers is think through first, or even just ask the inspector, how will these test results alter your recommendations for my house? And what you should hear a really precise answer of, if it does this is what I'm going to do versus that. Otherwise, just skip it and go toward fixing the problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's great advice right there, and just help get this education out there for people to understand that mold is everywhere and there's different levels of normal, and try not to get taken advantage of by contractors who are just going to bill you some absorbent fee for doing no real helpful work. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, James. This info you provided has been super helpful and educational to the audience here, so thank you.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
And thank you for my watchers, and thank you to the listeners. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Or if you have any specific mold questions, send Environix a message and they will help you out with that issue, or help you figure out that it isn't an issue. So until next time, have a good one. Thank you.